Hello, young soul. It was on one of those stuffy nights, where the air feels heavy, that I first heard about the so-called devil's weapon. I was sitting in a dirty bar at the end of the road, far from any big city. A place for simple folks, who drank to forget and live in peace with their own ghosts. The man who told me the story, an elderly gentleman with tired eyes, seemed more like a shadow than a real person. The hoarse and trembling voice he used was nearly lost in the sound of the beer bottle he was pouring into his glass. But I could perceive it, and from that moment on, I could never forget what he said. "You think everything has an explanation, don't you?" he began, the smoke from his cigarette falling beside him as if it were dying too. "But sometimes, there is no explanation for what you see. And what you see is the devil, my friend." He chuckled softly, but I noticed it wasn't a normal laugh. It was more like a sigh. Something someone does when they can't grasp the weight of their own words. I never believed it until the day I saw it with my own eyes. He paused, watching me with a weary gaze, as if weighing the decision to share what had happened. I didn't know, but he had already made the choice. I was heading to the village of Marquez, in the countryside. A place forgotten by God, and then they said the devil roamed there, but everyone shrugged it off. Just another one of those legends old folks make up to scare children. The old man smiled again, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He looked at me strangely, as if seeing something I couldn't see. Something that was already there, waiting. One night, my friends and I decided to take a shortcut down a back road, trying to save time. We thought it was a good idea, of course. No one liked to take the long way around. We reached a fork in the road, a narrow, dark path, with trees so tall they almost blocked the moonlight. And then, we saw something we couldn't explain. He looked toward the back of the room, as if recalling the image, and I could feel the tension build between us. That thing was not human. It was a shadow, but not of a person. It was more like a presence, a form of evil, squeezed between the darkness of the forest. It watched us with eyes I will never be able to describe. And there, in the middle of the road, it was a weapon. He raised his hand, as if he wanted to pause so I would grasp the importance of what he was saying. His eyes gleamed with something I couldn't understand. It wasn't an ordinary weapon. It wasn't a knife or a gun. It was a lantern. I looked at him doubtfully. "A lantern?" He stared at me seriously. But it wasn't just any lantern. It was as if it were alive. As if the very light of the lantern was made of souls. And the person holding it, they were no longer a person. She looked like a man, but her eyes were hollow, and her mouth was stitched shut, as if she had been silenced. He didn't say anything, but the lantern in his hand flickered on, and there, in the silence of the night, she began to call us. I could see he wasn't lying, or at least, he didn't believe he was lying. He was immersed in the story, in something that consumed him. And there I knew he was just beginning to recount what the devil had done to him and his friends that night. The old man continued, no longer caring about the other people in the bar. His story was consuming me so much that the world around me began to fade, as if I were being pulled into that cursed night. When that thing lit the lantern, the air grew heavy, as if the universe itself had stopped. I couldn't breathe right. Then, suddenly, the guy began to walk toward us, and the lantern illuminated, not the path ahead, but something within us. Something we carried inside. He looked at us as if he could see our souls, and everything began to make sense, you know? That man, that being, he wasn't there to kill. No, he was there to take something much worse. The old man's voice faltered, and he turned his gaze to the window, as if searching for some kind of salvation. I knew the story wasn't going to end well. My friends started to run. It wasn't a normal escape anymore. It was terror, pure madness. When the lantern's light touched any of them, it was as if their bodies lost their very essence. They screamed, but no sound came out. Just the sound of something breaking. When the lantern shone on one of us, his body twisted, he contorted. It was as if he were being ripped from the inside out. The thing in front of us was no longer human. It was something that should never have been created. The old man stood up, and his expression was that of someone who still carried that night. I realized that what he was saying wasn't a horror story. It was a warning. The atmosphere began to grow denser. Sweat dripped down my forehead, and the old man's words seemed to become an unbearable pressure. That being with the lantern, he saw us. He saw us like no one ever could. He took one of my friends and dragged him into the darkness. When the lantern went out, we knew there was no one else. He hadn't killed. He had taken something more. Something that would never return. His lantern, it didn't light again. And the night grew even darker. The old man's hand trembled as he spoke, and his face was marked by the despair of a man who couldn't escape what he had seen. Then, one by one, my friends fell. The lantern kept calling, shining, and they disappeared. There was no blood. There was no pain. They vanished, as if they had never existed. In the end, I was the last. But the lantern never called to me. The devil, he didn't need to anymore. He knew I had seen enough already. The old man looked at me, his eyes carrying the weight of everything he had lost. His breathing was heavy, as if recounting that story took more from him than I could imagine. I should have never escaped, he murmured, his eyes fixed on some distant point, far beyond the dirty walls of the bar. But the devil has patience. I swallowed hard. The entire bar felt different now. The low sound of the television in the corner, the clinking of glasses, the drunken murmurs in the background, none of it seemed real. Everything felt distant. I sensed we were somewhere between reality and that dark road where the lantern shone for the first time. And then, what happened? My voice came out quieter than I expected. He lit another cigarette with trembling hands. I ran. I ran without looking back. I ran until my legs couldn't take it anymore and my body collapsed in the middle of the dirt road. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining on my face, but the cold inside me never left. The old man looked at me. His eyes held a weight that made me feel small, insignificant. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, as if afraid someone else might hear. But I was never the same again. I knew he was still watching me. My chest tightened. What do you mean by that? He let out a bitter laugh. Do you think when the devil sees you, he just forgets? He doesn't forget, kid. He waits. The old man reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a dirty piece of cloth. Carefully, he unfolded the fabric and placed the object on the table. My heart raced. It was a lantern. Small, old, made of rusty metal. The front glass was dirty, stained with something I preferred not to identify. It seemed harmless, but it wasn't. The old man smiled, a sad, tired smile. It appeared at my door a week after that night, with no one to deliver it. No explanation. As if it was waiting. Silence filled the bar. I wanted to pull away from it. I wanted to leave, forget this story, pretend I had never heard it. But something kept me rooted in place. The old man ran his fingers over the rough surface of the lantern. It has never lit up since then, he murmured. But I know it's still alive. It watches me. It waits for me. And now it has seen you. I froze. What do you mean by that? He pushed the lantern toward me. My whole body shivered. It chose you. My stomach turned. This is a joke, right? I laughed nervously, trying to sound skeptical. You just want to scare me. The old man didn't laugh. I thought that too at first. My breath caught in my throat. You can leave now, he said, leaning back in his chair. But no matter how hard you try to forget, one night, when you least expect it, she will appear. In the back seat of your car. In the corner of your room. At your kitchen table. And when you turn on the light, she will be there. Waiting. I jerked up, my chair scraping against the dirty bar floor. This is madness. The old man didn't respond. He just watched me as I walked away. But before I left, he said the last thing I would hear from him that night. When her light turns on, don't look where she points. I exited the bar without looking back. The night was cold. But for some reason, I was sweating. And then, when I got into the car and closed the door, something gleamed in the passenger seat. A flashlight. The same flashlight. And on its glass, a reflection. Someone behind me. My breath caught. The reflection in the flashlight showed something standing behind me, a shapeless shadow that shouldn't be there. My muscles tensed. and a sharp chill ran down my spine. Everything in me screamed not to look, not to confirm what my eyes already knew. But fear has a strange way of controlling us. And before I could stop myself, my eyes slowly rose to the rearview mirror. And there it was. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a monster. It was something in between. Tall, thin, with pale skin and completely black eyes. But it wasn't the gaze that terrified me. It was the mouth. It was stitched shut. The thick, uneven stitches pulled at its skin in an unnatural way, as if someone had silenced that thing on purpose. The skin around it was inflamed, cracked, as if it was trying to scream without being able to. But the worst part was the feeling that I already knew it. The flashlight between us turned on. I didn't touch it. I didn't turn it on. It simply lit up. And the car disappeared around me. The flashlight's beam didn't illuminate the dashboard, nor the steering wheel, nor the dark streets outside. It showed something else. A place I didn't know. A dirt road, with twisted trees of dry branches, and a thick fog that swallowed everything. My heart pounded. I was no longer in the car. I was no longer in the city. I was there, on that damned road. My lungs burned as if I had run for hours, and when I looked down, I noticed something even worse. My clothes were stained with dirt and dry blood. Blood that didn't seem to be mine. The silence around me was absolute. But then, a crack broke the stillness. A foot stepping on the dry earth. I turned slowly. The flashlight was still in my hand, its light flickering. And ahead, just a few meters away, were they. The old man's friends. Or at least, what was left of them. Their faces were blurred, as if reality itself refused to remember who they were. Their bodies were contorted in impossible ways, limbs bent at long angles, like broken puppets. But there was one thing I recognized in them. The eyes. They were the same eyes I had seen in the old man. Filled with fear. Filled with awareness. They knew they were there. And they knew they couldn't leave. Something moved behind them. The darkness tore apart as if it were made of flesh, and then he appeared. The lantern bearer. The man with the stitched mouth. His dead eyes fixed on me. And I knew he had been waiting for this moment since the old man escaped. He didn't just want to take another. He wanted to replace. The lantern flickered in my hand, and its weight seemed to double, as if it were merging with my skin. An overwhelming despair washed over me. No, I whispered. No, but there was no choice. The lantern was mine now, and the shadows around began to stir. They were waiting for me to use it, waiting for me to point the light, waiting for me to choose the next soul. I felt it when it happened. The lantern grew heavier in my hand, as if something was crawling inside it, squirming beneath the glass. Its heat burned my skin, but I couldn't let go. It was as if my fingers were welded to it. The man with the stitched mouth stepped forward, and then I understood. The lantern was never a weapon. It was never an ordinary object. It was an invitation. My eyes burned as a light pulsed, illuminating the twisted faces around me. They didn't move, they just stood there, waiting. Their expressions were not of anger. They were not of hatred. They were of pleading. They were trapped there, each holding a scream that could never be heard. Each waiting for someone, for me, to free them. The lantern pulsed again, and I knew what I had to do. I could choose. I could point it at anyone, at any person. And when the light touched someone, they would come in place of those who were there. That was how the old man escaped. That was how he lived long enough to tell me the story. He chose someone. And now, I needed to choose too. My eyes widened as I realized the truth. I hadn't been dragged to that place randomly. The old man didn't tell the story to warn me. He told it to prepare me. He knew the lantern would find me. He knew that, in the end, I would be the next piece in this game. Mine screamed. My body trembled. I tried to drop the lantern, tried to run, tried to fight. But it was useless. The thing inside me had already been sealed. I had already been chosen. Then I heard a sound behind me. A car engine. I turned my face slowly, and there, standing on the road, was a man. Alone. He looked at me confused, his hands still holding the car door, as if he had just stepped out. The reflection of the lantern shone in his eyes. I knew he could see me, and I knew what I had to do. The light flickered, and my breath stopped. I raised the lantern. The man took a step back, his eyes wide, fear growing inside him. The light shone brighter, and then everything vanished. In the bar, an old man with a vacant stare took a sip of beer. His fingers trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. He watched the road outside, the night thick and silent, and waited, because he knew that one day, someone would walk through that door, sit beside him, order a drink, and listen to his story. And when that happened, the lantern would light up again, and the game would restart. The devil is patient, but he never waits for too long. I always knew something was wrong with me, but I never knew exactly what. The doctor said it was stress, another claimed it was just nightmares, and even a therapist suggested it was just a phase. But what I heard, what I felt, couldn't be explained by mere words. I found myself forced to live with something that dominated me and made me question my own sanity. It all started a few months ago, but there was one particular night that became forever etched in my memory. I was at home, alone, as I always was. The old house at the end of the street, secluded by overgrown bushes and trees, was the perfect dwelling for anyone seeking a bit of solitude. It didn't have great luxuries, but it was enough to hide me from the world. I went to bed, but as soon as my eyes closed, I felt an overwhelming pressure on my chest. The kind of sensation you get when someone sits on you, but no one is there. Darkness engulfed my room, but not like usual. It was as if the very shadow was squeezing against me, trying to suffocate my breath. And then silence. It wasn't a normal silence. It was deep, almost thick, as if the air around me had been sucked away, leaving only emptiness. The feeling that something was about to happen made me tense, but before I could move, the voices began. They were low, almost imperceptible, whispered as if they were inside my own head. The words were disjointed, but there was something unmistakable about them. It's coming, soon it will be you, death, it will come while you sleep. I tried to scream, but my throat was paralyzed. I wanted to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was listen, powerless, as the murmuring of the voices intensified, clearer, more urgent. They spoke about me, about my impending death, as if they knew something I still didn't. It was an inexplicable torment. Time seemed to stretch, as if the clock itself had lost its meaning. With each whisper, I felt the pressure mounting, a growing sensation of suffocation, as if something were coming from the shadows to take me. I tried to scream again, to no avail. My body was completely still, trapped somewhere between nightmare and reality. Suddenly, the sound ceased. Silence returned, but it was a silence that didn't seem to bring peace. I woke up gasping, my body sweaty and my heart racing. I got up and looked around, but there was nothing. The house was in total silence, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had heard. And I also knew I wasn't alone in that experience. In the days that followed, the voices didn't stop. They came every night, increasingly intense. I tried talking to the people around me, but no one seemed to understand. When I sought medical help, the tests showed nothing abnormal. The doctors were perplexed, yet unable to explain what was happening to me. Fear took hold of me, the fear of losing my mind. But the real twist came when I met Mr. Alencar, a resident of the village where I lived, who told me a story. He said he knew several people who, like me, began to experience the same episodes of paralysis and whispers. But the most terrifying part was what happened afterward. All of them died, he said, looking at me with a vacant, distant gaze. They died in their sleep, without warning, without pain, without anything. Death comes like a shadow, and no one escapes. The old man's words echoed in my mind. Was I next? What was really happening to my mind? And what was this sound, this threatening silence, that only I seemed to hear? I decided to investigate on my own. I began to observe the other villagers, trying to understand as they were going through the same thing. Soon, I noticed something even more disturbing. People started to disappear. They weren't natural deaths. They weren't accidents. They simply vanished. Now, I knew I was no longer alone in this. Something was closing in. Something not hid in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to take me. And I didn't have much time. In the following nights, the paralysis intensified. It was no longer a fleeting suffocation. It was a prison. My body was completely trapped, as if the very walls of my room had closed in on me. I tried to scream, but my voice died somewhere in my throat. My hands wouldn't respond, my feet wouldn't move. I was at the mercy of something I couldn't even comprehend. Each night, the whispering voices returned, increasingly clear, closer. Now I could hear their details, the different tones, almost as if there were multiple voices overlapping one another. They spoke of death, of silence, of the end, and worst of all, they spoke of me. We saw you, we heard you. It will be quick, almost like a sigh. You won't understand until the last moment. Death comes through silence. And the silence. Oh, the silence. I realized there was no longer just the absence of sound. It was something alive, something that surrounded me. Like an invisible entity slowly approaching, taking shape bit by bit. I knew something was there, but I couldn't see it. And the more I listened, the more terrifying it became. One night, when the whisper ceased, something changed. I woke up, or at least I thought I had woken up. The room was completely different. The air was heavy, dense, as if something had sucked all the vitality from there. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't the silence we knew. It was the silence of fear. The kind of silence that makes your body tremble, that makes you look around with a chill down your spine, because you know something is there, watching. Then I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, a shadow. It wasn't an ordinary shadow. It didn't cast from the walls or the corner like any figure. It seemed to live, as if it were trying to take shape, to mold itself into something more real. The shadow moved at impossible angles, stretching, bending, as if it were made of something beyond just darkness. And as it distorted, the voices returned, this time louder, more aggressive, as if they were screaming in my mind. Come. It's coming. Death while you sleep. You won't wake up. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed again. The shadow began to approach, floating over the floor with a sinister grace. It made no sound as it moved, but each of its movements seemed to fill the air with an indescribable weight, as if an invisible rope was tightening around my throat. The feeling of fear was so intense that I almost fainted, but I couldn't. I couldn't close my eyes, couldn't look away. The shadow was there, just inches from me, and the voices were so close it felt like my own mind was being torn apart. Then, something else happened. An unbearable pain, as if my body were being torn apart from the inside. It wasn't physical pain, but a sensation of fragmentation, as if something was spreading, shattering within me. I tried to focus, tried to understand what was happening, but I could only hear the voices, growing louder, more frantic. You are awake, but you are not alive. You are dying, and death is coming. Silent. And that's when I understood. The voices were not just a warning, they were not merely a notice. They were a reflection of something much greater, something that was invading my mind. Something that had been approaching slowly since the beginning. The next morning, I woke up again in my room. But something was different. The air felt denser. The sense of presence was still there, as if the shadow had left something of itself in the atmosphere. The silence felt more oppressive, more real. I no longer knew what was real and what was delusion. But one thing I knew, something was happening in the village. Something that was not about nightmares or sleep paralysis. Something that was leading people to death. And when I found Mr. Alankar on the street, the fear etched on his face left no doubt. He had lost his wife. Not to illness, not to an accident. She simply vanished one night, out of nowhere. He looked at me with wide eyes, as if fearing that the shadows would follow him too. You heard it, didn't you? He asked, his voice broken. I knew you would hear it. The silence. It's taking us. His words echoed in my mind, and at that moment, something inside me shattered. The silence, the shadows, the voices, everything was interconnected. But, even more terrifying, was the fact that no one was safe. Everyone in the village was being touched by this invisible force, a force we didn't understand, but that was undoubtedly taking shape. I had to find out what was happening. Not to save my life, but to understand what lay behind it all. Because deep down, I knew that if I didn't do this, death would come for me too, silent, while I slept. The days began to drag on, heavy and lifeless. The village, once simple and peaceful, now seemed shrouded in a permanent fog of fear. People distanced themselves from one another. Conversations, once common and lively, were now replaced by furtive glances and nervous whispers. I could no longer trust anyone. And worst of all, I could no longer trust my own mind. On the nights when silence engulfed me, I felt as if I were being watched, as if the invisible eyes of the shadows were following me. I didn't know if I was awake, or if this was an endless nightmare. But somewhere, deep in my mind, I felt that it was real. That it wasn't just a delusion. That something was happening. And something far worse than I could imagine. I began to obsessively investigate the deaths in the village. They weren't just normal deaths, accidents, or illnesses. People simply vanished. There was no explanation. No cause. When their bodies were sought, they couldn't be found. It was as if these people had been consumed by silence. It was an absence, an emptiness. I found an old file in the basement of the town library. It was hidden, as if someone wanted it never to be found. It contained accounts of disappearances and mysterious deaths that dated back decades, but the strangest part was that the cases repeated every 20 years, always with the same symptoms. Sleep paralysis, voices whispering of imminent death, the silence, and most terrifyingly, a reference to an event that occurred deep in the forest, where no one dared to go. Curiosity gnawed at me. I needed to know more. Something inside me told me that the secret lay there, in the depths of that forest, where the oldest residents of the village avoided speaking. Some said it was a cursed place. Others whispered of ancient rituals performed in a time so remote that no one remembered anymore. But everyone, without exception, seemed afraid of something that hid there. And that intrigued me even more. I could wait no longer. In the silence that had settled over the village, I felt the pressure building in my head. I needed to understand what was happening. I could no longer be a passive observer. So, on a gray morning, I gathered my courage. I went into the forest. The trail entrance was covered by tall, imposing trees. The wind made no sound. The air was thick, stifling. The leaves on the ground were piling up, but there was no familiar sound of an animal or the wind rustling through the trees. It was as if nature itself had been muted. I walked for hours. With each step, the feeling of being watched intensified. I could feel the cold ground beneath my feet, as if the earth was trying to swallow me. And the further I went, the more the sense of loneliness grew. There were no more sounds of life. The silence, that very same silence that filled my nights, seemed to follow me now, enveloping me. Finally, I reached a clearing, an open space where the trees receded to reveal a circle of stones. The stones were arranged in a strange manner, as if they were being used for something that should not be seen. In the center, there was a structure, an altar. It was covered in moss, but the signs of use were unmistakable. There was something there that seemed recent. That's when I saw it. On the ground, beside the altar, were traces of something I couldn't immediately identify. But as I approached, the sight burned itself into my mind irreversibly. They were human remains. Fragments of flesh, broken and shattered bones. But the most horrifying part was the way they were arranged. It wasn't just a dismembered body, it was pieces, laid out with a cold precision, as if someone was trying to assemble something. A wave of panic hit me instantly, but I couldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or paralysis that had taken hold of me, but my vision began to blur. I could hear, once again, those whispering voices. It was no longer just a distant whisper. It was a crowd. They were around me, close, so close it felt like they were inside my own head. They whispered unintelligible words, but the only thing I could comprehend amidst it all was one word: initiates. And then, the worst happened. The air began to change. Shadows moved erratically, distorted, as if something was trying to emerge from the very darkness. That's when I saw what was left of those people. Something was moving in the shadows, something that shouldn't be there. The body of a woman, with broken bones and torn skin, was standing. But she was not alive. Her hands were stretched out towards me, fingers contorted into impossible shapes. And her eyes, empty and lifeless, were fixed on me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. The silence was consuming me. The voices were all around me now, growing louder, more aggressive, as if they were pleading, commanding. I was paralyzed, unable to move, to escape. The shadows completely enveloped me, and then, in a final gasp, a distorted laugh cut through the air, a laugh that was not human. And with that, everything vanished. I woke up in my bed again. But it was not like before. I felt an emptiness. Something inside me had shattered, something that could no longer be fixed. The silence was now with me, not as a lurking specter, but as a part of me, a presence that would never abandon me. I knew now. What I had seen in the forest was not an accident. It was not the remnants of a ritual lost in time. It was a sentence. A cycle that repeated, a marking of those who were being chosen. And now I knew, I was marked. I no longer knew where fear ended and reality began. Every night, as I closed my eyes, a shadow stretched within me, reminding me that I was no longer free. The paralysis, the voices, the shadows, everything had merged into a singular experience, a mental prison from which there was no escape. There was no safe place, no refuge. When you are touched by death, it never leaves you. I thought it was just a nightmare, an illness of body and mind. But upon revisiting the file, I found something that defied all logic. A final page, dated 1947, described the end of a series of events that coincided with my own symptoms. In the last paragraph, someone, a name I could not decipher, scratched out by something like a blade, had written, "Silence is a sentence, and there is no escape. They come, and there is no morning." That sentence haunted me so profoundly that doubt became a reality for me. Who were they? What did it mean by "there is no morning"? Was it a warning? Or a threat? The following night, what began as yet another sleep paralysis turned into something infinitely worse. The voices whispered, and now they were not just vague words. They were instructions. Go to the altar. Your soul will be taken there. Deep down in my mind, I knew the place they were leading me to was the forest. The same place where it all began, where the fragments of flesh and broken bones told stories I was not prepared to hear. I had no choice. It was as if something was pushing me, dragging me into the darkness. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into an abyss of terror. When I reached the clearing, the altar was different. It was no longer empty. Now, before me, were other figures. Pale. Lifeless. Their eyes were empty, but as I approached, I saw they were not corpses. They were alive, but trapped in a state between body and soul, as if death was waiting for them, but had not yet arrived. I felt the pressure of the air in my chest. I couldn't breathe. A searing pain coursed through me. And in that moment I realized I was not there merely as a spectator. I was part of the ritual. I was the sacrifice. My soul would be the last to be taken. What remained for me was silence. The silence that, at that moment, took form, growing around me like a thick, pulsating fog. The last sound I heard was a sigh. My own sigh, lost in the void, as the pressure of death enveloped me. It was as if the air around me dissolved, and with it, I disintegrated. A cold hand touched me, a hand that was not human. A chilling touch, from something that had existed long, long ago. And then silence. It was no longer the silence of before. It was not an emptiness, it was an echo. Something that was present, watching me, waiting. Waiting for whom else? Death was not an end. It was merely a wait for the next. An eternal wait. I woke up once again. But something was different. When I looked around, what had once been my home, my room, no longer existed. The environment seemed distorted, like a twisted painting. I was no longer in my reality. I was outside of it. The air was thick, heavy, and the shadows danced in the corners as if feeding on something within me. The silence was inside me, outside me. I felt the presence of something, as if being watched by invisible eyes, something that wanted me, something that knew what I was thinking. The voices returned. Now they were clearer, closer, whispering in my mind, "You cannot escape. You will not wake up again." I then realized that there was no turning back. The cycle had no end. They were there, always had been. The silence was not the end, it was the beginning. And you, young soul? You are not alone either. I remember it like it was yesterday. The first time he told me about those children. His name was Fabio, and I worked with him in a small town in the countryside. Sometimes, at the end of the day, he would sit with me and start talking about something I could only understand much later. He would say, in a low voice, that the children were there. They won't leave. They are always watching, waiting, he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if it was something he himself couldn't grasp, but knew to be true. Fabio lived in a house at the end of the road, near an old abandoned school. The school had been useless for decades. In fact, I didn't know anyone who knew what had happened to the children who had studied there. However, every time we passed by the road and looked toward the crumbling building, something seemed to stir in the shadows. It was a strange feeling, as if the house itself were alive, waiting for something. I, of course, never thought much about it until the day I went there. When he asked me to come to his house that night, I had no idea what was waiting for me. Fabio always seemed nervous when he mentioned the place. But something told me I needed to see it with my own eyes. I arrived there around midnight, with the full moon illuminating the deserted road. Fabio didn't look well. His eyes were sunken, and his previously warm smile was gone. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked as soon as he saw me, as if he already knew the answer. He didn't need to explain. The air was heavy, and even before entering the house, I could feel the presence of something distant but there. In the kitchen, Fabio told me more about those children. "They don't talk, don't play. But they are always there, waiting," he whispered, visibly terrified. The first time I saw one of them, it was at the window. A small, pale face, with big black eyes. And it looked at me. And I knew, in that moment, I wasn't alone. Fabio told me that for weeks, the children had been appearing in his dreams. They were in the hallway of his house, in the shadows, always watching, always waiting for something. But what? He didn't know. He only knew that each night it became harder to sleep. They were there, like shadows moving with the wind, always around him. I then decided to spend the night at Fabio's house. The tension in the air was palpable. Minutes passed like hours, and all we could hear were the echoes of our own breaths. But no matter how much we tried to ignore it, something was there. It didn't seem human or animal. It was more like a presence, something occupying the space, crawling along the walls of the house. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a laugh. A child's laugh, like a kid playing hide and seek. I looked at Fabio, and his eyes were wide, fixed on the hallway door. I wanted to scream, but something inside me held me back. The feeling that something was about to happen paralyzed me. And then, the sound of footsteps echoed in the house, light and silent. Fabio didn't want me to stay there anymore. He tried to convince me to leave, but curiosity urged me to stay. That's when I heard something more terrifying than anything I could imagine, a soft, almost inaudible voice coming from the dark hallway. "It's time, Fabio." The next morning, Fabio was pale. His eyes, still fixed on the void, seemed to have been ripped from his own body. "The school, right?" he asked without looking at me. And I knew. What he meant was something darker. He knew that the children had begun to inhabit the school as well. He knew there was no longer any difference between what was in his house and what was in the school. Both were empty, foreign presences. He took me there after begging me not to tell anyone what was happening. "The school," as always, was shrouded in an aura of abandonment, with crumbling walls and vegetation engulfing the steps. As we reached the entrance, a chill ran down my spine. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The shadows seemed to move, undulating as if responding to our arrival. As we entered, darkness engulfed everything. The broken, dusty lamps did not help. But it was the smell that nearly made me faint. It was the scent of something old, moldy, yet with a sweet, almost sickening touch. Fabio appeared disoriented, as if in a trance, and pulled me further inside. Then, at the end of the hallway, a small figure appeared. It was a child, but it had no human face. The eyes were completely black, like bottomless pits. It stood there, watching us. Fabio said nothing. He simply moved forward, as if that child was the key to something he could not control. But as he stepped forward, the ground trembled, and an invisible force pushed us back. The child didn't move, but it seemed to smile. And the smile, I will never forget. It was a sinister smile, as if inviting us into its eternal prison. Fabio was weak. His eyes were becoming more opaque, and the fever consuming him was inexplicable. "They won't leave, they need me," he murmured in a trance, while I desperately tried to understand what was happening. Time passed strangely, as if the minutes no longer made sense. The house was filled with giggles, whispers, and I felt they were everywhere, inside and outside the house. Fabio began to shut himself off more, avoiding my presence, and a feeling of paranoia took over me. Until one night, I woke up feeling that something was watching me. In the dark, in some corner of the house, I heard the sound of irregular breathing. When I looked, there was nothing. But the eyes, those eyes, were there once again. They were no longer children. They were things, grotesque transformations, deformed bodies of children, with sharp teeth and sinister smiles. They were there, in the dark, waiting for my fear. Fabio disappeared. I don't know what happened, but when I returned to his house, it was empty. All that remained were his words echoing in my mind. "They won't go away. They need me." The school was deserted, but something told me there was still something there. I heard the laughter again, and what I saw was Fabio's last look, not as the man he had been, but as the child he had become. And now I knew. I was trapped there too. And the children, well, they were still waiting. After that night, I never saw Fabio again. His house was abandoned, the windows always shut, as if something inside was waiting for his return. I tried to forget him. I swear I tried. But no matter where I went, or what I did, the feeling of being watched never faded. At work, I felt eyes on my back. At home, I heard giggles in the dark, the sound of bare feet running across the floor. When I looked, there was nothing. But I knew. They were there. One night, overcome by a mix of fear and obsession, I decided to return to Fabio's house. Something inside me screamed to stay away, but another part, deeper, more irrational, wanted answers. Upon entering, a smell of mold and rot hit me like a punch. The air was thick, laden with something invisible yet present. I walked slowly down the hallway, each step echoing in the empty house. And then, something made me stop. At the end of the hallway, a door was ajar. The only one that had always been locked when Fabio lived there. My heart raced. I cautiously pushed the door open. The room was an old children's bedroom, but it seemed to have been abandoned for decades. Peeling walls, furniture covered in dust, old toys scattered across the floor. But what made my blood run cold was a drawing on the wall. It was a figure of a man surrounded by several children, all with black eyes. Above them, scrawled in shaky letters, was written, "They don't want to leave." Suddenly, I felt a weight in the air. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the absolute silence had been broken by a faint sound. Breathing. A light, childlike breath. And then, a voice whispered behind me, "Do you want to play?" I turned impulsively, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The only sound was my own rapid breathing. But then, before I could convince myself I was imagining things, something moved in the dusty mirror. I approached, my heart pounding in my throat. And what I saw then nearly made me faint. My reflection looked normal, but beside me, a pale child with black eyes stared at me intently. Its face was blank, expressionless. And then, it smiled. I ran out of the house, my body consumed by a terror I had never felt before. But no matter how hard I tried to escape, I knew that something inside me had already changed. From that night on, the dreams began. I found myself inside the abandoned school, surrounded by small, distorted shadows. They whispered, laughed, called my name. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and see silhouettes at the edge of my bed, motionless, just watching. What was that? Ghosts? Demons? Or something worse? My fear grew with each passing day. I started to avoid mirrors, avoid dark places. But the more I tried to escape, the closer they came. Until one night, I woke up with a horrible feeling of suffocation. My body was paralyzed, and in the darkness of my room, I saw something. The children were there. One of them climbed onto the bed and loomed over me, her face just inches from mine. Her skin felt like cold wax, and her eyes were endless abysses. And then, she whispered something that tore me apart inside. Fabio is waiting. After that night, I realized I was going insane. Or maybe I was already doomed. I needed to go back to the school. It was the only place where I could find answers. That early morning, driven by a despair that no longer made sense, I went there. The place was even darker than I remembered. The wind blew through the broken windows, making a sound that resembled children's laughter. I walked through the corridors, my body consumed by terror and the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. And then I arrived at the main room. In the center there was a small chair. Sitting on it was Fabio, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were no longer his. They were black, empty, just like the children's. He smiled. They chose me, he said, his voice now laden with something inhuman. And now they chose you. The doors of the room closed on their own. I tried to run, but it was too late. The children emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the dark. They approached, surrounding me, whispering softly. And then, everything went black. Epilogue. They never leave. I was never seen again after that night. But they say that if you go to the abandoned school and listen closely, you can hear children's laughter echoing through the halls. And if you look through Fabio's house window, you might see a figure standing inside, waiting for me. Because now, I am one of them. And the children never leave. What happened after that night was not forgetfulness, nor liberation. It was something much worse. I didn't die. But I'm not alive either. I'm here, trapped between the two worlds, between light and shadow. I see you. I can feel when someone listens to this story. I can hear your breath getting heavier, the chill rising on your skin, the silence around you becoming suffocating. And I can feel when you start to believe, because that's how it begins. It was like that for me. It was like that for Fabio. And it will be like that for you. You can pretend you didn't hear. You can convince yourself it's just a story. But tonight, when you turn off the lights and lie in bed, you will feel a presence in the dark. Maybe a whisper. Maybe a soft giggle. And when you finally muster the courage to open your eyes and look around, don't be scared if you see a child standing in the corner of your room. They are just waiting to play with you. And if you listen closely, you might hear a familiar voice saying, right next to your ear, now, it's your turn.